All right. In 1835, in Mount Vernon, Mississippi, still shaken by Nat Turner's rebellion 4 years earlier, slave owners in that area were convinced there was going to be a slave revolt. So they started interrogating other slaves, like the man that conveyed this story, Israel Campbell. There wasn't going to be any slave revolt. This was an imaginary concept, but they were convinced that this was going to happen. But what they did is they acted on that imaginary threat. For 2 days, the local slave owners massacred the slave population. And when they were finished, they actually threw a party celebrating their murderous victory over the menace that was imaginary. So, fast forwarding to today, in America, there are 800,000 dreamers. These are people who came to this country as children, brought by their parents. These people pay more taxes than most Americans. They shouldn't say they don't pay more taxes, but they pay taxes like most Americans, but they do pay to stay in this program. They also have to follow a large amount of criteria, and on top of that, they have access to virtually no benefits like most Americans. But, one last thing is that a recent UC San Diego study projects that these people will produce over $400 billion into our economy in the next decade. But the problem is that this administration believes, again, with the imaginary, that these people are taking jobs without any data, without any evidence. That's how they see it. So in my work, I try to bridge these parallels, bridge things that happened in the past but are still happening today, and that things that we don't understand. This James Baldwin quote really exemplifies the work that I try to do. Behind it is my timeline piece, which is 3 pieces of canvas that represent the 3 eras of African American history: slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, and our time since the last Civil Rights Act was passed. In my work, I mostly use portraiture, but I try to span that roughly 400 years. Talking about that timeline piece, which will come back up here in a second, each year is represented by an inch. And so slavery, which was 247 years in this country, Jim Crow apartheid, which was roughly 103 years, and then since the last Civil Rights Act, it's only been 49 years. And this is what I really try to present in my work and help people understand that that's 350 years where white supremacy was normal. And for us to think that we've eradicated that sort of mindset, especially without even knowing what happened in that time, is something that's probably not happening. So recently, I finished a project about Rodney King. And in it, it focuses on the superhumanization of African Americans that's always exists. Being able to overpower two British soldiers is how, in 1770, John Adams, the future president, described Crispus Attucks, who was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre. Fast forwarding to 1992, and this is the Rodney King piece that I did. And in this first panel, one of the police officers who beat Rodney King almost to death describes Rodney King as still being able to move as fast as any professional linebacker. So we all know about the 3/5 rule, or 3/5 status when it came to slavery. But what we don't really consider is that those millions of 3/5 still added up were counted into the population, giving the South an advantage congressionally in Congress because it made their population larger. Fast forward to today, where we incarcerate more people than any other country, but also most of those people are of color. And they still count as part of the population, even though they can't vote, and even though they're in a place that isn't where they're from, and which changes congressional districts and changes the demographics of those communities. One thing what we should always consider when we see criticisms of Black Lives Matter's movement is in 1963, the March on Washington, 60% of Americans polled thought it was a bad idea and thought it was wrong. And then if you fast forward to 1966, 85% of white Americans thought that civil rights protests didn't help the movement towards racial equality. And then in this image in this coming up image, I should say, there's one of a piece of hate mail that Martin Luther King received, where a person actually sees the term Black Power as basically a threat. The other image, oh, actually that's not the right image. Well, I'll skip to that one. This image is of Albert Memmi. He was a thinker, a French thinker, and this quote basically exemplifies a problem that still exists. Most Americans don't want to be racist. White Americans don't want to be racist, don't see themselves as racist, but it still exists. This is a perfect example of it. This was said by the community of Levittown, which is a white-only suburb, and they actually said that they believed that they were not racist in keeping their town white-only. And then this brings us to things that the president said on his campaign. He wasn't indirectly, but directly referencing what happened during the civil rights movement to people who were protesting, but he referenced it in a positive way. He said this is what should happen, and he was still elected. Okay, and then this image is, again, going back to the timeline. Also, this isn't the correct order, but I can keep going. Again, this is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, and this is what I really try to stress in my work, that no matter how good your intentions are, it's still important to understand the past.